Open up to 1 Samuel 31. 1 Samuel 31. Which, if you'll note, is the last of the books in 1 Samuel. I think I mentioned when we started into this study, in the Hebrew Bible, there is the book of Samuel. And it is 1st and 2nd. So you could say we're halfway through the book of Samuel, but we're finishing up with 1 Samuel. Starting in chapter 28, we've seen the events that are leading us towards the battle of Mount Gilboa. The book of 1 Samuel ends with the battle of Mount Gilboa. We'll see that tonight. The Philistines have come up from Aphek. They've come up from their land on the west, and they have gone all the way up to the north, and then kind of into the central region of Israel, and they've encamped at Shunem. The Israelites have encamped first at Gilboa, chapter 28, verse 4, but then they move just a little bit further north, and they come and they encamp at Jezreel. The battle of Mount Gilboa will start in the valley of Jezreel, the battlefield of Israel, where the battle of Armageddon will one day be fought there in the north. Chapter 28 tells us about Saul seeking the counsel of the witch in Endor. You remember this? It's interesting because Saul had to go behind enemy lines to get to Endor. Endor was behind Shunem. So not only was he doing something that was immoral and wrong, he was doing something that was extremely dangerous. Going behind enemy lines, he went with 2 of his guards. Chapter 29 tells us that while Saul was doing this, David was being told by King Achish of the Philistines that his generals didn't want David to fight alongside them in the coming battle. With good reason, don't you think? Because they were worried in the middle of the battle, David's going to switch sides, he's going to give his men some kind of a signal, and they're going to start lopping off Philistine heads, and it's not going to go well for us. So, at Achish's command, David returns to Ziklag. He's not going to take part in this battle. In chapter 30, which we dealt with over the last 2 weeks, David comes back down to Ziklag. It would have happened at or during the battle of Mount Gilboa when this happened. Again, the events of chapter 28, 29, 30, and 31 overlap. We're not exactly sure how, but it wasn't that chapter 28 happened, then chapter 29 started. They were happening at the same time. Different perspectives. In chapter 30, David and his men come back to Ziklag, and they find that the Amalekites have raided and taken their wives, their families, goods, and burned the city of Ziklag to the ground. Well, David and his men hit rock bottom. David's men contemplate mutiny. In verse 6 of chapter 30, they think about stoning him. But David is a leader of men. It seems that God used this difficult time to get David's attention. It's kind of like God was ringing David's doorbell by taking away everything that he had, by bringing him to the end of himself, as God does from time to time. God got a hold of David, and in verse 6 of chapter 30, we read that David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. David then seeks the Lord's direction for the first time that we have recorded since chapter 27. He finally says, God, what would you have me to do? He says, Lord, should I pursue the Amalekites? And God says in verse 8, he says, pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. And so with God's word on it, David goes to battle. They find an Egyptian who was a servant to the Amalekites, who leads them to the Amalekites, and they spend either 12 or 24 hours just killing Amalekites until they have killed all but 400. 400 escape on camels. David and his men recover everything that was taken. All of their stuff, all of their family, and all of the other stuff that had also been taken by the Amalekites during their raids. So David makes out very well. And we saw last week that David kind of starts to step into the role as king. He's been a warlord. He's the head of 600 of Israel's finest warriors. But now he kind of steps up, and rather than divide the spoil just among his men, rather he sends and he gives to the people of Judah. He gives them what they had lost because the Amalekites had raided against them, but he also gives them additional, what they had taken from other peoples. And so David is winning hearts and minds. But now we come to the battle of Mount Gilboa. David's down in the south. He's in Ziklag, what's left of it. He's going to be coming back into Israel very, very soon. But perhaps even as David was doing this, even as the events of chapter 30 were unveiling, the battle of Mount Gilboa was going on in the north. Take a look at verse 1 of chapter 31. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell down slain in Mount Gilboa. Again, the Israelites and the Philistines meet in the Jezreel Valley, but the Israelites are routed, and so the Israelites retreat up into the mountains of Gilboa. Retreating's hard enough, but when you have to retreat uphill, it's really bad. Saul and his men are retreating uphill into the mountains of Gilboa. Gilboa there is Mount Gilboa, from which we get the name of this battle in history, but there were also kind of the foothills. So there's not just Mount Gilboa, there's the mountains of Gilboa. Verse 2, and the Philistines followed hard upon Saul and upon his sons, and the Philistines slew Jonathan and Abinadab and Melchishua, Saul's sons. Now, Saul has 4 sons. Well, he actually has 6. He has 2 by a concubine, but he has 4 sons by his wife Ahinoam. So you see here the family tree of Saul. He has Jonathan. Why do we know him? David's friend. Abinadab, he's also called Ishwi in another verse, so 2 names, which was fairly normal on that day. Melchishua, and then Ishbashev, and he has 2 daughters. Now, if you go and you look, and when we look at 2 Samuel, we'll look at some more, but he had a concubine named Rizpah, and by his concubine Rizpah, he had 2 other sons. He had Armoni, and Saul had a son named Mephibosheth. Now, why would that be confusing? Because Jonathan also had a son named Mephibosheth. Now, if you were going to steal family names, Mephibosheth probably wouldn't be the one at the top of your list, but that was the one. So Jonathan has Mephibosheth. So as you're reading, Mephibosheth, that Jonathan's son, was the one who was lame, who David took into his house when David came into the palace. The other Mephibosheth, Saul's son, plays a little bit of a role in the book of 2 Samuel. So when we get there, we'll look at that. But Saul has these sons. We don't have a lot of information regarding Abinadab and Melchishua, but Jonathan was his eldest. Jonathan would have been king if Saul hadn't blown it with his rebellion and disobedience. Ishbashev. Ishbashev, the name means man of shame. And if you read ahead, read into 2 Samuel, you'll see a little bit of why perhaps he lived up to his title. So the battle is going poorly, to put it mildly. Saul has lost his men. He's lost his sons. He's retreating. Look at verse 3. And the battle went sore against Saul. And the archers hit him, and he was sore wounded of the archers. Then said Saul unto his armor-bearer, draw thy sword and thrust me through therewith, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and abuse me. But his armor-bearer would not, for he was sore afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell upon it. Sore wounded, that phrase there, that he was sore wounded of the archers, it means that he was the idea of painful writhing. So Saul's a mess at the end of his life. When you are wounded by archers, you're talking about probably more than one arrow, right? So it would be bad enough to get stuck by one. Philistines were good archers. They've hit him multiple times. He knows it's coming to an end. So he turns to the man who cared for and carried his weapons and ordered him to kill him, to prevent his falling into the hands of the Philistines, who he says, these uncircumcised. That's a term of derision that was used by the Jews for anyone who wasn't a bearer of the seal of the Abrahamic covenant, circumcision. Saul was worried, justifiably so. that the Philistines, if they took him alive, would torture him. In Judges chapter 1, we read of a Canaanite king named Adonai-Bezek. When Adonai-Bezek would capture kings, rival kings in combat, he would take them to his palace and he would cut off their thumbs. He would cut off their big toes, and he would make them gather their food under his table. We read in Judges 1 that he actually had a number of kings to which he had done this. Kings of the Middle East had perfected torture for their rivals, and they were especially good, not just to soldiers, they were especially hideous when it came to the other kings of other nations. So Saul, rather than face this terrible fate, he chose death at the hands of one of his own men. But when that was refused, he committed suicide. It doesn't really come as a surprise now, does it? Does this surprise you now that Saul is committing suicide? It would have surprised you back in chapter 9, but it's not really a surprise now. It's kind of foreseeable. The foreseeable end to a man who has forsaken God and who's had the presence of God withdrawn from his life. The Spirit of God departed from Saul. And Saul himself now comes to his end. His death comes in fulfillment of the prophecy given by Samuel in 1 Samuel 28, verse 19, where we read, "This was Samuel when he was called up by the witch at Endor." This is what Samuel said. He said, "Moreover, the Lord also will deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow thou and thy son shall be with me." Where was Samuel when he said that? Dead. He was dead. That's what he meant. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hands of the Philistines. Verse 5, "And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he fell likewise upon his sword, and died with him. So Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men, that same day together." Death follows the man, and especially the leader, who is outside the will of God. Saul has made his choices. He's made a host of bad ones, and death is now coming in spades. What does the Bible mean, though, when it says, there in verse 6, when it says, "And all his men died that day"? Did every soldier in the army of Israel die in the battle of Mount Gilboa? Is that what we're to understand? Not likely. Not likely. It's possible. But usually, when Scripture speaks of destruction of that magnitude, it gives us more information. For example, in Joshua chapter 8, verse 22, speaking of the battle of Joshua at Ai, it says, "And they smote them, so that they let none of them remain or escape." The Bible usually gives us a little bit more. When everybody dies, the Bible usually goes a little bit further and says, nobody made it. Even in the last chapter, in 1 Samuel chapter 30, verse 17, speaking of the Amalekites that David fought with, we read, "And David smote them from the twilight even until the evening of the next day. And there escaped not a man of them, save 400 young men which rode upon camels and fled." A more probable interpretation would be that all of Saul's personal guard passed. They died in the battle, and all of the troops that he was personally leading. It wasn't a total loss of the entire Israelite army. Another reason for this interpretation would be the next verse, which tells us of more chaos and loss. Look at verse 7. "And when the men of Israel that were on the other side of the valley, and they that were on the other side Jordan, saw that the men of Israel fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook the cities and fled, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them." Take a look here at this map, and you'll see the forces of Saul. You see, look down here at the inset. That's a little bit more of the information. So you see where the battle happened, where there's the little star below Shunem. So the Israelites retreat. Saul dies up in Mount Gilboa. But word starts to travel. The battle's not going well. Lots of Israelites are dying, and so we find that on the other side of the valley, they're fighting in the Jezreel Valley. Saul and his troops retreated to the south. So if they're on the other side of the valley, where would that put them? They're on the north side. So the Israelites have been dispersed. They're not just on the south side, they're also on the north side, on the north rim. It says also, they that were on the other side Jordan. You see the Jordan? The little blue squiggly line? That's at least 20 miles from Jezreel or Gilboa to get over there to across the Jordan. Or I'm sorry, at least 10 miles. So, news travels pretty fast of Saul's defeat. The loss of their king leads them to abandon hope. And so they abandon the cities. The men of Israel, they say, look, we're going to be overrun. The Philistines are coming. Our king is dead. Our army is decimated. Let's get out of here. So they leave, and they leave their cities. And because of the abandoning of their towns, you read there at the end of verse 7, and the Philistines came and dwelt in them. So now the Philistines have bases of operation all over northern Israel. Is that a problem? Yeah, that's a problem. It's a big problem, and it will continue to be. We won't see it tonight, but that will be a problem on into the future. Look at verse 8. And it came to pass on the morrow, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen in Mount Gilboa. Why would they strip the slain?
Take their stuff.
Take their stuff. They're looking for valuables. They're looking for spoil. They're stripping the slain, and they come across Saul and his 3 sons. And they, absolutely, a trophy. And they cut off his head, stripped off his armor, and sent it into the land of the Philistines round about to publish it in the house of their idols and among the people. Now, I want you to think with me for just a minute, way back to 1 Samuel chapter 9. When we were first introduced to Saul, we're told a little bit about how he looked. We're told of his physical appearance. What was the one thing, particularly, that set Saul apart from everybody else?
He was head above everybody else.
He was from the shoulders upward above everyone else. We read in 1 Samuel 9 verse 2, and he had a son, this is Kish, Saul's father, whose name was Saul, a choice young man and goodly. And there was none among the children of Israel goodlier person than he. From his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. But following his shameful death, even that is taken away from him. He's no longer taller than the people because they take his head off. And so Saul is made equal with all the common people. Kind of interesting, isn't it? That the one thing that set him apart, the one reason why the children of Israel thought, oh, this is the guy. This is the king. Even that's taken away in death. His defining quality is taken away from him by the hands of a pagan enemy. They not only beheaded his corpse, but they take his body and his armor, and they do a victory lap in Philistia. They take his armor, and they go and they show it. The idea behind this behavior was to prove the efficacy of the gods of the victorious people over the gods of the losers. They're saying, essentially, look what our gods did to the Israelites' God. Do you remember where David found the sword of Goliath? When he ran from Gibeah, do you remember where it was? It was in the tabernacle. The priests gave it to it. Why would the sword of the Philistine champion be in the tabernacle? Well, for the same reason, because it was to say, look what our God did. And now the Philistines take the armor of Saul, a giant among Israelites, and they do a victory lap in Philistia. Saul's armor was put into the house of Ashtaroth. Ashtaroth is the Canaanite goddess of fertility. If you go into how she was worshipped, it's pretty sordid. Saul's body is nailed or fastened to the walls of Beit Shean. Beit Shean had been a city of the Israelites, the tribe of Manasseh, but it was certainly one of the cities that was taken by the Philistines after its abandonment in verse 7. Why? Because the children of Israel said, we're being overrun. So they go away, And the children of Philistia come in and they nail Saul's corpse, his headless corpse, to the walls of an Israelite, now occupied Philistine town. But something happens. Kind of the last thing that we have recorded for us here in this book. There are some heroes from Jabesh Gilead. Look at verse 11. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, comma, we'll stop there. What do we know about Jabesh Gilead? Here's the map. Here's where we are. Jabesh Gilead, you see on the, not in the inset, up at the top, all the way as far over as you can go, there's a dot that says Jabesh Gilead. It's on the east side of the Jordan River. Way out, okay? The whole battle took place on the west side, with the exception of the Israelites running away. Jabesh Gilead is on the eastern shore of the Jordan River. It's 20 miles south of the Sea of Galilee, or as it was known in the days of Old Testament, the Sea of Chinnereth. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, when Saul was just coming in and being made king, the people of Jabesh Gilead were besieged by an Ammonite named Nahash. Maybe you remember this because Nahash said, we'll let you surrender, but if you surrender, if you want to have peace, we're going to come and we're going to pluck out all of your right eyes. Do you remember that? That was the deal. Peace for you half of your eyesight. Okay? Sound like a good deal? Pretty solid? What would we say if that were to happen today? If Ukraine were to say, look, Russia has declared that we can have peace, but they have to pluck out all of our right eyes. Do you think there would be public outcry? There would be. There was. Word came to Saul. And Saul, who is just coming to becoming king, he's just been anointed, he's just been declared king, and word comes, hey, the people of Jabesh Gilead, all the way over on the other side of the Jordan, they're in trouble. There's an Ammonite over there named Nahash who wants to pluck all of their eyes out. And so Saul's first act as king was to assemble an army, and they go and they slaughter the Ammonites and their king who had been troubling Jabesh Gilead. So we come full circle, all the way back. Now Saul's body, stripped of its armor, is nailed to the wall of Beit Shean. And so the men of Jabesh Gilead stand up to try to avoid further shameful treatment of the body. Look at verse 12. All the valiant men arose and went all night, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons, which apparently were with him, from the wall of Beit Shean and came to Jabesh and burnt them there. They go at great risk to themselves, because again, Beit Shean is occupied territory now. They go at great risk to themselves. They take down the bodies. The word fastened means impaled. So they had somehow stuck the bodies of Saul and his sons, and the men of Jabesh Gilead go. They take the bodies down. They go all night, and they return. They make it all the way home, and they burn the bodies of Saul and his 3 sons. Why would they burn them? That's not typically what Jewish people do. They don't typically burn. Well, probably they were burned in order to prevent further desecration. They've been decapitated, they've been impaled, much has happened. So very likely to prevent further desecration, and also, and I think this probably has more to do, to hide what had already been done to them. Nobody wants to see the body of their king, their at one point beloved king. Nobody wants to see a mutilated corpse. Nobody wants to see the bodies of Jonathan and Melchishua and Abinadab. Nobody wants to see that. So the men of Jabesh Gilead take and burn the bodies. Verse 13. And they took their bones. Because usually, unless it's a real hot fire, the bones don't burn like the rest. They have the bones left over. And they buried them under a tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. Burial was and still is of great importance to the Jews. So after they destroyed the bodies, they buried the remains. And then they fasted, a sign of mourning culturally. Now, What are the lessons for us out of this 13-verse chapter here? It's kind of a weird place to end a book, isn't it? It's not quite the climax we were hoping for when we started. Remember back in 1 Samuel 8, verse 19, we read, "Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel and said, 'Nay, but we will have a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles.'" How'd that work? Not well. Not well. The king they chose, Saul, didn't work well. He wasn't the king that God would have given if they would have waited, but they got impatient. Now Israel is defeated. They've lost an unknown but very large number of their soldiers. They've lost cities in the north to the Philistines. And the king that they begged for was nailed to the walls of their cities along with his sons before his body was reclaimed, burnt, and buried. There are an awful lot of lessons to learn from this life of Saul. He's been kind of the focus here at 1 Samuel. We started out with the life of Samuel, and then we come to Saul. When I think of Saul, I think of lost potential. He had all the makings of being a good king. When he started, he was decent. He was humble. He wasn't looking for position. He cared for the people. But Saul squandered much of what might have been because of his rebellion and disobedience. And just as we saw with Lot this morning in Sunday school, Saul's choices were far-reaching, and the consequences went much further than he would have thought. Do you think when Saul decided, "I'm not going to wait for Samuel," when he made that choice, and he said, "I'm going to do this myself," do you think he foresaw himself and his 3 sons impaled on the walls of Beit Shem? Probably not. Probably not. If he would, he wouldn't have made that choice. David wrote in Psalm 37, verse 23, he said, "The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. He delighteth in his way. Though he fall, he shall not be utterly cast down, for the Lord upholdeth him with his hand." David, as we've gone through this, I hope it's opened your eyes. Was David perfect? We haven't even gotten to what happened with Bathsheba. David was far from perfect. David had a little bit of a temper on him. David sometimes did things impulsively. David wasn't a perfect man, but David did desire that God would lead his steps, and David's highest goal in life was to please the Lord. Saul started out humbly and even felt the power of God upon him there at the beginning. But he quickly began to attempt to order his own steps, and they went downhill quickly. Next week, we're going to wrap up, and we're going to conclude our study of 1 Samuel. We're going to go back. We're just going to kind of put a bow on it, and we're going to get some of the lessons and kind of get an overview so that it can stick. So that's what we'll do next week. So come with questions. If you have questions about what we've done, come with those, and we'll talk about it. My goal is eventually to preach through the whole Bible. So I hope you're buckled up, okay? But we're going to go to 2 Samuel next. Not next, but we will do 2 Samuel. But we're going to take a break, and we're going to go into the New Testament on Sunday nights. We're going to do some more doctrinal study, and then we'll come back, and we'll look at 2 Samuel. We're going to go into some of the New Testament, some of the epistles, and we'll deal with that on Sunday evenings for a little bit, and then we'll come back, kind of alternate between the two, which I would recommend you do in your own study. So come with questions. Next week, read ahead. Read 2 Samuel. I would encourage you, read over 1 Samuel. Go over it and just kind of let it settle in, because if you're anything like me, you hear a lot of facts and you hear a lot of things, and it loses its touch on your mind if you don't keep it before you. So read over 1 Samuel. Just 31 chapters. It won't take you the whole week, but take a little bit of time if you're able. Read it over. And then we'll go into 2 Samuel here eventually. So.